I'd like to acknowledge Australia's First Nation people as the traditional custodians of the land, and for this episode in particular, the Peramang and Kaurna people. I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging.
I'd like to think that the people who have lived and worked here in Coonawarra at Wynns view this part of their life as being rewarding and that they have made a contribution to a chapter of the Australian wine story.
This is Over a Glass. I'm Shanteh Wale. Sue Hodder is one of Australia's most renowned and respected winemakers. For over 3 decades, she has crafted some of the country's most collectible and long-lived wines at Wynns Coonawarra Estate in South Australia. Her achievements are remarkable, on paper, in person, and of course in the glass. Hi Sue, thanks for joining me.
Hello Shanteh, thank you for that lovely introduction.
Well, it's very well deserved. I have been drinking your wine since I was first legally allowed to. My father was a great collector and they mean a lot to the foundation of my wine base of knowledge and my love of wine. So it's so wonderful to have you join me on the podcast. Thank you so much for making the time.
Well, I thank you and your father for that support. And coincidentally, today is the last day of our picking Coonawarra Cabernet. So that's all picked and nicely in the fermenter. So it's lovely to be able to relax and talk to you for a moment here now.
Oh, I feel like we're a day early then. But I mean, tomorrow maybe you can put that aside for truly relaxing and not having to talk much, perhaps.
Always plenty of talking to be done.
Sue, you grew up in Alice Springs of all places, and I only know a handful of people that have had some time there. So tell me what your life was like growing up in Alice Springs.
Shanteh, it was amazing, and I love Alice Springs, and particularly with the passing of time. It was in the 70s, and at that time it was opening up, and there was a whole new frontier. We had a lot of Americans living and working with us. Indigenous politics were really starting to get some needed momentum, and there were a lot of government services as well as the tourism and rural community. It was exciting, and I'm glad I grew up there.
Absolutely. I feel like, we all need to do a little bit of time, out in rural places. And what was your upbringing like? Were your parents wine drinkers? When did the idea of wine first cross your path?
They were wine drinkers, but sometimes I say, think inside the box, the bag in a box. And so there was a lot of, in fact, Renmano Super 6, which was a 6-litre cask of like a Moselle, we called it. But in hindsight, it was well-made wine, slightly sweet, and an alternative to beer.
It kind of rolls off the tongue, that one. I can imagine that was, something that was found in many homes. Did you manage to taste that wine when you were young, maybe as a scamp, tasting a little bit of your parents' wine?
Yes, a little bit. It wasn't that nice. And then I, of course, went to Roseworthy College to do agricultural science, and I could see all these plonkies, as we called them, having a great time and really drinking beautiful wine. So that's when it all started.
Tell me a bit about your Roseworthy Ag College experience. Did you make some great friends, and are you still in touch with them to these days?
Yes, I did make great friends, and we just had a significant reunion last year, and it was great to see people and what they've done with their lives. But we loved living out there at Roseworthy, which is just near the Barossa Valley, and no one had a car then or a mobile phone, so we were all there together on campus. But increasingly, I feel very grateful for my agricultural background and training and thinking, it's really stood me in good stead. So I'm very grateful for that.
Now, you don't strike me as a person that perhaps would play many wine games or drinking games these days, but did that still take part in the Roseworthy days?
Yes, certainly did. Yes, no. Absolutely is the short answer, Shanteh. Yes.
Well, I'm glad to hear that, because that is kind of a rite of passage for anybody that's at university having a good time. Now, tell me about, what happens after college. Where do you go and what's your first step into the big world of wine?
Well, I'd finished my course and needed some money, and I went to the Barossa for a vintage job. And I was an Aggie, not a winemaker, but I applied for a job with Rob Gibson, who you may know. He's got Gibson Wines in the Barossa, very successful. And he was a viticulturist at Penfolds at the time, and they had just acquired the Kaiserstuhl Cooperative. And that was an amazing time, because Kaiserstuhl had all these beautiful old vineyards in the Barossa, the growers, and many of them still deeply Lutheran. And Penfolds wanted these vineyards, but they didn't really know anything about them. So Rob had the job of characterising them and visiting and making the picking decisions, and I was his assistant, and I loved that job. And again, it's really informed my future approach in the vineyards, and I'm very grateful for that opportunity and, of course, the money.
Yes, indeed. Tell me, was there a moment when you were with Rob that cemented, actually, this is definitely the path I want to be on, or was it more a kind of collective experience of many times together?
Look, it was collective, and like many things when you're that age and just keen to get moving with your life and career, didn't really realise or acknowledge at the time how good that thinking and approach was. And I guess the penny dropped years later about how rigorous and methodical it all was. And I'm, as I said, very grateful to have been part of it at the time.
So tell me a little bit about your first official role in the wine industry. Where was that, and what can you remember about that time?
When I actually went travelling overseas for 2 years in the early 80s, including grape picking in Bordeaux and then a vintage in California. And then I came back and did a graduate diploma in enology at Roseworthy again. And that was excellent. And after that, I got a job with Ed Carr and Kim Tolley at Seaview, making Seaview sparkling wines and the range of wines that they were making at the time. And that was really busy times. There were a lot of the commercial category of Australian wine was sparkling wine. All these labels like Minchinbury, Seaview, Kaiserstuhl, and then Yalumba had Angus Brook. They were really important wines, and they brought a whole category of consumers along to wine. So that era has passed, but it was really important at that time.
Do you remember, delving into the sparkling wine realms and kind of thinking, whoa, this is quite technical and quite different from the other kind of things that you had learnt?
Absolutely. And but it was really more about getting organised and logistics, which is still winemaking. It's not the nuanced or technical or romantic side of things, but it really was about making sure everything was lined up and fastidiously planned, because it was really interesting and quite different from making other wines.
Yeah, and I think we often don't talk so much about the logistics of large operations, or like you said, with sparkling, there's a lot of machinery that's needed, because it doesn't perhaps feel as romantic as tasting grapes and wandering around vineyards, but it's a huge part of, any successful operation, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And it's a lot of microbiology and planning and quality control, but it's still really important. And like any production of food, things can go wrong, and it's important that all the analysis and preparation is done at the right time for quality ultimately.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, you did spend, like you said, some time in Bordeaux picking grapes. You also spent some time in the Napa Valley. When you were in those two places that were vastly different from Australia, what did you learn?
Look, I learned that there was an amazing wine community, and that grapes are grown around the world with basically the same goals or lifestyles, but of course it was a lifestyle, I think, Shanteh, that and I loved that. And I loved the agriculture being transformed into something lovely, which was wine, and then the different seasons and the soil, and then the cycle of it all, to put it into plain terms. I really loved that.
I mean, when I often think about, especially trying to get a hold of people at this inappropriate time during vintage, but it makes me think about, that downtime after vintage, but also just that it never really stops, then once that hectic time is over of getting everything picked at the right time, and then the winemaking, begins. And it is a full cycle that happens right throughout the year, with not a lot of time really where there's not much happening, is there?
Well, that's right, Shanteh, and thank you for acknowledging that, because, of course, everyone's saying, oh, what a relief, we've got all the grapes in, and we have had this very dry season, which has been fantastic for grape growing in the vintage, but the region and the soil and the vines really need a good rain. But we're relieved to have all our grapes in, but the work now starts, and we've got everything on skins, and we've got to make sure that the ferments are nicely comfortable and that they go through properly, and then of course the malolactic fermentation, and then ultimately off to barrel. But the cycle continues.
No rest for the wicked, as they say. Tell me about entering into Wynns in 1993 and what your thoughts were, in your first week, because, these things don't just happen overnight, and you stepped into some very big shoes. So what were your first impressions?
Well, I had come from sparkling wine, so I was really a bit out of touch with making table wine, but of course I'd made a little bit and had a basic understanding. But I was friends with the winemakers who were here at the time, Peter Douglas and Peter Bissell, and I came over here ready for the vintage, and it was full on. It was a big learning curve, and Wynns was going really well, and I always loved the Wynns wines, and I just got swept into it. But for the first 6 months, I was just in a whirl. I was on night shift, and I look back on those days, and it was hard going, and I was relieved when it was all over. But yes, that was a baptism of fire for sure.
I think it's so important to recognise with all your success is those moments, because there's somebody out there that's just stepped into a new role, that's trying to learn a million and one things in one go. And, there is a light at the end of the tunnel, but sometimes you do have to hit the ground running. And I would love to see some photos of that time, because it's just it's wonderful.
They wouldn't
to
have
imagine.
been pretty, Shanteh.
And tell me, you've been really frank in the way that you've talked a little bit about the history of women in the vineyards at Wynns, and also kind of over the years. Tell me a little bit about kind of the role of women and how you felt being a woman at that time in the Coonawarra.
Well, Coonawarra has, which Coonawarra, as you know, is a small community, and there have always been women in important roles in this region. And Pam Dunsford was a Wynns winemaker, Australia's first female qualified winemaker. She didn't live here, but she came for vintage. And there were women in the family properties, and there are people like Di Davidson, who used to come down here, and there were women working here at Wynns when I arrived as well. So I feel like Wynns has a long and strong history with women, which would have been different from the average Australian winery at that time.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that. And it's kind of the reason I asked that question, because I think sometimes we forget that, just because perhaps, maybe it was males that collected some of these wines, that there is a great history with women in Coonawarra and some really influential figures there. And it essentially, like you said, it's a small community. So there's lots of family history of people owning wineries out there. And I think it's wonderful to see that there has been such pioneering figures come out of Coonawarra.
Yes, it wasn't all perfect in the marketing arena, though, Shanteh. We've got some posters of that you wouldn't see them now, truly cringeful, and then pictures of marketing women who really were just glorified sort of hostesses serving wine to people that wanted to try it. Now, probably really talented, creative women that just wanted to promote the wine. But it was the era, and thankfully that aspect has really improved.
Yeah, I think we need to look back at pictures like that, and instead of the shock and the horror, remember, look, that is shocking now, and that's how far we've come. So isn't that a wonderful reminder of how you just would never see something like that anymore? And that's wonderful.
Absolutely.
Now tell me, I've heard from a few people about what makes Coonawarra unique, but tell me about what you love about making wine in Coonawarra.
Well, of course, there's the physical aspects of being here, and increasingly with climate change, we acknowledge that it really is very special. For example, we've just finished picking, and some people are still picking over Easter, but most regions in Australia have finished. Now, a lot of that would be to do with the fact that Cabernet is a late ripening variety, but we have had a very good year, and we, of course, love the influence of the Southern Ocean and that cold upwelling that brings in the cooler air when it occurs, and that happened early on this year for us. And it really creates this special climate down here in the Limestone Coast. And that combined with the Terra Rossa soil, which is a red clay loam over limestone, really gives us a special place for growing grapes in plain terms. And it's the more winemaking I do here, the more I realise how special it is. And then, of course, there's the community. This is a farming community. We are not close to a large city, so people that live here are involved in farming largely to a great extent, and it is a small, tight-knit community. We all, sometimes we say we live in each other's pockets, and that's true to an extent, but it is a close-knit community, and I live on our vineyard here at Wynns, and so do most of my colleagues here. So it's quite different, and we've had a long vintage, so we're definitely familiar with each other by now. At Easter, a nice break will be good. But the combination of the grape growing environment with the soil and the climate and the community and the fact that it is off the beaten track away from the cities really give us this different style of community.
Yeah, it's a special place. And I think still to this day when I talk about it, I think about how lucky travellers are to get out there and do tastings where you've got families that make or grow the grapes or make the wine, often pouring at the cellar doors. It's kind of something we don't see as much anymore. And I've got photos of my mother and father driving through Coonawarra collecting wines, and, there's still the essence of what Coonawarra is all about and that real hospitality that still exists there, and it's such a beautiful thing.
Well, for example, Good Friday at the community club, there'll be fish and chips down there, and all visitors to the area are welcome to go down there and have that very casual meal with people that have just finished grape picking and people that live here. So it's all right there.
That's pretty cool. Tell me a little bit about your work with Alan Jenkins, your viticulturist, and the relationship that you have.
Yes. So Alan Jenkins arrived here in the year 2000, and I had known Alan already from Roseworthy days, and coincidentally he had spent some time in Alice Springs as well. And when he arrived at Wynns, it was at a time when our vineyards we had a large area in the Terra Rossa soil and a large vineyard area, and the vineyards really needed some attention, and Alan really had to get stuck into them and bring them back to a good shape. They had had too much very not minimal pruning at Wynns, but they were certainly machine hedged in many cases, very low crops. We had only sprinkler irrigation for frost, and this is all on this beautiful soil. And Alan had to embark on this large-scale project of cutting them back and threading them back onto new trellises, which the old ones had largely disintegrated, that some of them were just like bush vines, and getting drip irrigation lined up where where appropriate. We still have some dry grown vineyards. And now that was a undertaking of a couple of decades, and it really transformed our vineyards, our wines. They were immediately brighter and more suitable to our medium-bodied style, the fresher acids, better colours immediately. Now, of course, we couldn't do every vineyard at the same time, but it was a profound time for Wynns Coonawarra Estate. Furthermore, Alan was a big thinker, is a big thinker. He retired 2 years ago, and Ben Harris has now taken up his role, and he's an incredible thinker as well. But Alan was really up for climate change acknowledgement and what we could do for the future. And talking about soil health and regenerative agriculture and different ways of approaching our vineyards. So he was also a teacher, Alan, a tutor, and he had a great way of engaging with people. And I'm talking about him as if he's no longer around, but he's just retired up to the Barossa. But I'm just in reference to his time at Wynns, he was really an incredible communicator, and he was very good at telling people what we were trying to get done here at Wynns. And it was a privilege and an honour to have those couple of decades with Alan here at Wynns.
Yeah, that's for sure. And I've actually heard quite similar words from Ben Harris, who, by the way, has some of the most startling blue eyes I've ever seen in my life. Every time I speak to him, I forget what he's saying because he's got such blue eyes.
Yes.
And the most beautiful smile.
Yes.
But he has spoken some similar words to me about Alan and the very important work that he's carrying on from him. So,
yes.
Wonderful.
And Dr. Kath Kidman too. Alan really mentored and inspired some amazing people who have already at young ages made a contribution to Australian wine and viticulture.
That's for sure. I've got so many questions for you, but one of the ones I want to ask, and I don't know how to quite phrase it, but when you make the wines that you do, and Wynns has such an incredible history over time, you've had the privilege of tasting lots of wines that have matured over decades and eons. What is the formula of great Cabernet that makes it so ageable? And are you constantly thinking about, when you're making these wines, about where they will look in 10, 20, 30, 40 years? And how do you still make them drinkable on release? It seems like a magic formula that is almost impossible, but you managed to do it.
Well, thank you. And we're always thinking about how we can do it better. But we, when I first arrived here in 1993, we were making wines that were bigger in structure and had more tannin. And that was a style preference around the world, Bordeaux, Napa, that the early 90s, and probably more so in the 80s. Now, when we did our tasting of 50 years of Wynns Cabernet, and we did that in 2004, the 1960s wines were an absolute revelation. These medium-bodied, bright wines, moderate alcohol, low oak, and they'd still aged so well. Now, of course, we had tried wines from the 60s before that, but not in a context of a big vertical 50 vintages. And it was just a reminder that medium-bodied wines made that way and could age gracefully, and they reflect a sense of place. And so we then started thinking about how we could finesse the tannins in the vineyard, and that's a big topic, but and a lot of viticulture that relates to that. And when we were selecting parcels for our single vineyard wines or our John Riddoch and Black Label, if things were too tannic and they weren't balanced, we had to remember that really they have to be balanced now when we release them, or they're never really going to come around to the quality that we want. It was a small myth that these tannic wines eventually softened and became balanced, and they don't. In our situation with our wines, and so we made wines that were brighter and less oak. And I have to credit my colleague of 27 years, Sarah Pigeon, for all the work that she's done on appropriate barrels for the Wynns Coonawarra Estate wines. She's done an enormous amount of trials every year to work with the coopers and find the barrels that suit our style. And so we just gradually chipped away at that, and then we were complimented for that style, and the time was right, and we were delighted to be able to have success or recognition, or people saying they like to drink them was the ultimate success of these wines that were lighter in body but still had good varietal characteristics and texture. So we feel confident that those wines will age because they're from the same vineyards that we've always worked with, and that which are in better shape than they were. Many of them haven't been replanted. We've got a lot of lovely old vineyard here in the Terra Rossa soil, and we have these wines from the 60s as our inspiration. And if we can't make wines that age for a medium to long term, we've got some soul searching to do, Shanteh, because we'll be letting the label down.
Well, that's for sure. I will still remember some of the wines I've tried from the 60s in your cellar door with you, and they were life-changing. But I have full faith that the wines you make today will do the same for someone else long down the track. You are about to release your luxury collection, and you do have 2 brand new wines.
I know. Very exciting. And we've got a Cabernet Franc. And look, we've had these vineyards for a long time, and we've been a bit hot and cold on Cabernet Franc, if I'm honest, and some vintages were better than others. And 2024 was a lovely year, and it really suited that vineyard, and we've released it as a young wine. It's a soft young wine, and the few people that have seen it so far have been really positive. So we're hoping that that's the next chapter to our story.
Absolutely. I feel lucky to count myself in that, and I was totally charmed. I'll leave everybody else who wants to taste that wine to make their own conclusions, but very, very exciting indeed. I want to ask just a kind of final kind of question in terms of, your time, which has been momentous at Wynns. If you were to kind of close your eyes and think about what you would want your legacy to be, what would you want people to say later down the track that was, your imprint on Wynns?
Look, so many things. Of course, that the vineyard and wines and winery itself were left in good shape, whatever that means for the future. I'd like to think that the people who have lived and worked here in Coonawarra at Wynns will view this part of their life as being rewarding, and that they have made a contribution to a chapter of the Australian wine story.
I think that's beautiful. I mean, you do want people to know that, you know, the time they've spent in an organisation is something that they can go ahead and mark in their lives as being really important, but also that they had fun and that they felt cared for. I think that, you know, what you have done for the brand has been amazing. But in general, as a person, for our whole Australian industry has been remarkable.
Well, Shanteh, thank you very much, and thanks for your ongoing storytelling, because without you and your peers, we've got nothing. The story doesn't get out there. So the wine in the glass is one thing, but the stories and the people and the history, the vineyards are another, and it takes a lot of research and articulation.
Thank you so much. And it's truly my honour. It's, you know, I agree with you. There's so much that a wine can do in a glass, but when you add all the people and all the land and the care all around it, it becomes something else, quite indeed. Tell me, if you could only drink 3 wines for the rest of your life, Sue, what would they be and why?
That is a very difficult question, and I would choose Australian wines. And I love Seppeltsfield Apera DP117. I also love Arras Sparkling, and we had the 2015 a while ago, and it was amazing.
Fresh.
Yes. I love our Wynns Black Label Cabernet. I genuinely love drinking it. And if I could sneak another 4th one in, it would be Tyrrell Chardonnays. I think they do an amazing job.
Wow, fantastic 3 choices. I am so with you on the Apera, and I don't think anyone's ever said that, and I love that. So we should definitely have a glass of Apera one time together.
I'm here for it.
But beautiful selections. Sue, it's been such a joy. Certainly the highlight of my entire week or month to talk to you, and I hope our paths cross again soon. Thank you for the time, and best of luck with the very end of vintage.
And thank you, Shanteh. Really appreciate your time.
Cheers to you, Sue.
Bye-bye.
This is Over a Glass. I'm Shanteh Wale. Stay tuned for more stories from the world of wine and drinks. Listen in every Thursday on your podcast app. Follow us on Instagram at overaglasspod and contact us at overaglass@deepintheweeds.com.au.